Hi class, this is Dr. Dinka, and today I would like to provide a review for quiz 3 that you have this week. In particular, I would like to review some of the concepts that we studied last week during week 7. In particular, chapter 4 of Human Rights from Introduction to Global Studies. And these issues that we studied last week are even more relevant today, given today's crisis and human rights abuses that are taking place in Ukraine as a result of Russia's invasion of this sovereign nation state. I would like to point out, for example, that something mentioned in chapter 4, human rights, is not only the human rights themselves, but how difficult it is to enforce these human rights. For example, something mentioned in the article is the International Criminal Court, ICC, that came into place in 2002. And this is a permanent international court that is designed to hear cases of violations of human rights, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And it is a last resort, a court of last resort, and will only act when nation states cannot or will not be able to do that. And it's very interesting that actually yesterday there were talks in the media, in the news, about the International Criminal Court opening an investigation to possible war crimes or crimes against humanity in Ukraine perpetrated by Putin and Russia. So this is very interesting that the International Criminal Court is getting involved. And also this brings up a question that a lot of people are asking: why aren't NATO and the other states, because we learned about NATO 2 weeks ago, why isn't it NATO stepping up and stopping Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And the answer to that is that because of this treaty of NATO, they have to abide by the treaty too, so they cannot go into another country and defend it unless that country is a member of NATO. And that's how this whole conflict started, because Ukraine would like to become a NATO member so that it has the back of all these Western democratic states from Europe, and they have a lot of military arsenal to defend each other. And you can see here in this map all the states in darker color. They became a NATO member from 1949 to 1989. And this other more recent nations, they became NATO members recently after the fall of communism. So you have from here Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Poland. Even though they're not part of the Soviet bloc, as I mentioned before, they were under communist influence. So the Kremlin was still controlling a lot of aspects of their political situation in their countries. Now, what's interesting is that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they became NATO members. So let's say, for example, if the Russians, they are allied with Belarus, if they, by mistake, they attack Lithuania, then all the NATO countries can go in and defend Lithuania, and of course, then they can retaliate against the Russians. But there's not much they can do, sadly, very sadly, until then, except for imposing sanctions and some other measures to hopefully stop this terrible tragedy that's going on in Eastern Europe right now. Going on now to the next slide, I will be talking about the origin of human rights. And I know we looked at the Declaration of Human Rights and some of the articles there, but when did this concept emerge? So basically, there are two schools of thought about the origins of human rights. One is the natural law and positivism. And I wanted to look in particular at natural law because I'm more familiar with it. And it has to do with the philosophical ideas of that can be traced back to the writings of St. Thomas de Aquinas, John Locke, Hugo Grotius, and Francisco Suarez. And the main idea is that though not derived from any one religion, natural law emphasizes duties imposed by God and suggests that the common human morality exists in all human beings. And in other words, all people have an inherent sense of right and wrong. And because natural law is considered part of nature, proponents argue that it has validity everywhere. I wanted to look in particular at the original text of Thomas de Aquinas and just look at the fragment from that text. So St. Thomas de Aquinas was born in Naples, Italy in 1225, and he devoted his life to God, and he taught at the great medieval University of Paris and at Naples. And he died in 1274, was canonized in 1323, and in 1567 was proclaimed a doctor of the Universal Church. Now, something interesting about Aquinas is that according to him, reason is able to operate within faith and according to its own laws. And the mystery of God is expressed and incarnate in human language. Is thus able to become the object of an active, conscious, and organized elaboration in which the rules and structures of rational activity are integrated in the light of faith. And this is we have the beginnings of this idea of natural law. Now, in the Aristotelian sense of the word, although not in the modern sense, theology is a science. It is knowledge that is rationally derived from propositions that are accepted as certain because they are revealed by God. And the theologian accepts authority and faith as his starting point and then proceeds to conclusions using reason. The philosopher, on the other hand, relies only on natural light of reason. So Thomas de Aquinas was the first to view theology expressly in this way, or at least to present it systematically. And in doing so, he raised the storm of oppositions back when he lived. Now, regarding this idea, we also have today, for example, some people mention that the sun is placed at the right distance from the earth and that plants and life on earth are by design and they are the work of God. I would like to quote from St. Thomas de Aquinas, one of his books called On Law, Morality, and Politics. And this is where natural law is introduced in this paragraph. And this is what St. Thomas Aquinas mentioned, that all things partake somewhat of the eternal law insofar as, namely, from its being imprinted upon them, they derive the respective inclinations to their proper acts and ends. Now, among all others, the rational creature is subject to divine providence in a more excellent way insofar as it partakes of a share of providence by being provident for itself and for others. Wherefore, it has a share of the eternal reason, whereby it has a natural inclination to its proper act and end, and this participation of the eternal law in the rational creature is called the natural law. In other words, so all human beings have the sense of what's right and what's wrong. That's why you don't see a lot of people going and committing crimes, and most people tend to agree on what's considered something good and something bad, something that shouldn't be done. So more specifically, the natural law posits that good law must be in harmony with or reflect the essential nature of all people, incorporates only those principles of justice rooted in the natural reasoning process, laws that meet the above requirements are immutable. Now, the school of thought also positions the existence of human rights, arguing that they are an inherent part of the individual, and they are not dependent upon a state or a document to legitimize them. Rather, each individual is born with these rights. States can pass laws that denies people rights, but it does not mean that people are not entitled to their rights. And for example, natural law proponents point to the near universal condemnation of the Nazis' abuses during the Holocaust as evidence of the existence of natural law. Even though German law may have made legal much of the atrocities of the Holocaust, natural law suggests that there is a higher law than that of states, and that states should in fact abide by the natural law of respecting the life, liberty, and dignity of the individual. Now, when do we have a draft, so to speak, or the first instance of a written evidence of these human rights the way we know them today? And interestingly, that took place right after the French Revolution in Europe in 1789, when the French National Assembly passed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizen, a document containing a list of rights to which all French citizens are entitled. And you have here on the left side, La Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen. So a lot of these, and it's very interesting, you have them here, they also serve the base for the Constitution for the United States of America. And in particular, if you look at the first one, where it says men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. The second one, the aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, prosperity, security, and resistance to oppression. And it's something, of course, that the United States strongly is based upon, this concept of liberty, of prosperity that we have in the Constitution. Now, let's look at the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen and their connection to modern Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. So I would like to look at the original rights from the French, after the French Revolution, and then the ones passed by the United Nations in 1948. So it's interesting that these rights actually became the basis of the modern human rights. So the French, in a way, were really ahead of their time. So, for example, the right to speak one's opinion, this would be Article 11 in here, which states the free communication of ideas and opinions is one of the most precious of the rights of men, and became Article 19 in UDHR, that states everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. Now, we do have this modernized language, and of course, all this media that didn't exist back in the 18th century, but the main concept remains the same. Also, something that's very interesting, it's Article 10. And this is because I know some of you focused on this for your human rights country report. And I think it's an interesting topic, especially because some people might not think about this, right? About freedom of thought, freedom of religion, that people in the United States were born with this privilege, right? Of being able to exercise this right of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. But other countries don't have that right. And we'll see in a little bit that people were persecuted, imprisoned just because they were expressing that right of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So let's look at Article 10. It said, no one shall be disquieted on account of his opinions, including his religious views, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law. Became actually Article 18. And we have a broader definition of this. So it states, Article 18 in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. And you know, it's very interesting when you come to the United States from other countries and you see all these places of worship. So you have Catholic Church, you have Methodists, you have Protestants, you have mosques, you have all these denominations that are able to freely exercise this right and practice the religion of their choice. And as I mentioned, this was a problem back in the former Soviet Union that, of course, Putin was a part of. And that's because they were trying to suppress this freedom of religion in particular. So the communists were not, sadly, they did not love religion, nor did they allow for people to practice their religious views. And this happened, you know, not only in the Soviet Union. If you look here at the map, it was huge. Look how huge it was. And then you have all these other countries. Ukraine was a part of them. Then you have the Kazakhstan also. So it extended in actually a lot of parts of the world. But because of the proximity and their political system, they had influence on other countries as well. For example, on Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland as well. So in a way, this idea is that the Russians had of suppression of freedom of thought, freedom of religion was took place in other countries around them. So, for example, in that article that I had for you guys last week, Romania exposes communist crimes. Mr. Basescu, former Romanian president, mentioned that the communist regime trampled on the law and forced its citizens to live in lies and terror. So the communists had a big, they made a big deal of freedom because they like to control. They like to control every aspect of their society. For example, in Romania, they only had one TV channel and they were broadcasting the news, the communist parties, and maybe they were giving like a cartoon or two or like a movie, but TV during the communism was only, they had one TV channel from like 6 p.m. until 11 p.m. and that was it. Also, if people were listening to other radio stations illegally or having westernized ideas, they could be jailed and put in prison because the communists, again, they did not like freedom. They were the anti-freedom regime. Some people who didn't agree, they were put into prison. Others, they tried to escape. Now, talking about illegal immigration, people who were trying to cross the border illegally from these communist countries, they were shot at the border. So a lot of people who managed to escape had to cross at night in dangerous situations. You can look up Nadia Comaneci's escape from communism. It's a very interesting story. Now, going back to this article, Mr. Basescu leveled 21 charges against the communists, among them the imposition by force of a puppet pro-Soviet government in 1945, the destruction of Romania's democracy, and persecution in the name of class struggle of entire groups of Romanian population. And this is really relevant today because this ideas that the communists had, look what happened. It brought another war in the world, because we have this clashes of communism, of this neo-communism, with the idea of freedom, of democracy. And we saw this in the invasion of Ukraine and the disregard for human life and the human rights in general. It's a very sad situation, but it started with all these crimes that the Soviets committed throughout decades. So for them, sadly, it almost became like something normal, which it have not been. Part of this human rights that were not respected was, and in that video that I had for you guys, was Mr. Tertullian Langa, who was in prison for 17 years simply because he's part of a religious community that has ties to the Vatican, the Greek Catholic Church, even though it's similar to the Orthodox Church. And the communist regimes I mentioned in the former Soviet Union and other Eastern European countries were trying to cut off and limit access to any connections with Western Europe, where most countries were democratic. And you'll see how Articles 9 and 18 of the UDHR are not respected in the video. So we have Father Tertullian Langa, and in the short clip, A Survivor's Story, Persecution and Torture in Romania During the Communist Regime, Mr. Langa shares his experiences of being imprisoned and tortured. And I'd like for you, as you watch this video, to think about some of these human rights articles and how they are respected or not in this video. So for example, you have Article 9, and no one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. And Father Langa is actually talking about this when he was imprisoned and sent to forced labor for, he said, for 20 years. It was without merit. It was just on arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. Also, this is Article 18 that we talked about before. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religious. These rights include the freedom to change religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. And I know it's hard for people from the United States sometimes to imagine, right, what it is like. And that's why we're studying this, so that we know more, so that we can empathize with people who went through hardships in the past. So this Father Langa, just because he was religious and he held on to his convictions, he spent 17 years in prison. That's something that we cannot even imagine in the United States of America, where everybody is free to practice the religion that they chose. Now, we talked about human rights violations, but who actually monitors and enforces these human rights violations? And I talked about this at the beginning of this lecture. And I think it's the main challenge of the United Nations and of the proponents of the UDHR. How do you enforce and how do you correct some of these human rights violation? It's not easy, as I just mentioned, with the situation in Ukraine. One particular role that NGOs have, so non-government organizations, is that they actually act as, they have a little bit of a power in monitoring, at least monitoring and enforcing these and making people aware of the human rights violations. So historically, these NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, have played a very important role in the promotion of human rights, as evidenced by their involvement in the creation of the UDHR. And many countries have internal organizations that monitor how their state is abiding by its international human rights obligations. For example, in Israel, there is B'Tselem, which monitors human rights in Israeli occupied territories, while in Lebanon, the Palestinian Human Rights Organization monitors the rights of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. Also, there are human rights NGOs that work globally. Amnesty International is one of the most known one, and Human Rights Watch it's another organization. And if you think about the discussion board that we had 2 weeks ago, where you guys had to find an article from the Human Rights Watch from their website. Now, Amnesty International works on behalf of those who are illegally detained, tortured, or harassed by governments, issuing both urgent calls for actions and press releases. And they also urge members to write letters to abusive governments, calling for their compliance with international human rights laws. And additionally, Amnesty International produces an annual report that reviews countries' human rights records, and countries do pay close attention to this report, and it is often cited by policymakers. So they do have an impact, but it takes a little bit for any change to happen. Now, something else that we looked at last week was Maquilapolis, or the City of Factories, and it's a documentary by Vicky Furnari and Sergio de la Torre, where they examine some of the human rights violations, in particular workers' rights, that took place in Mexico, in Baja California. And this was something that was brought on by globalization and by these companies who were looking for profit at any cost, and they did not care about who was suffering. Now, again, this is something brought in by the capitalist enterprise in the disregard of these companies for the conditions of their workers. So let's look at Article 23 from UDHR that states, everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. Now, we know that favorable condition of work, the workers in this documentary, mainly women, they were working in poor conditions. They where they lived, which is close to those factories, they had contaminated water, air, they had health issues as a result of those contaminants. And also, for example, they're not allowed to take breaks or use the restroom when they need it. So again, we have clear violation of Article 23. Also, everyone without any discrimination has the right to equal pay for equal work. This is something that's actually still being debated, even in the United States. And we have this gap between what the wages for men versus women. And some people, they point out to surveys and data that show that sometimes women can earn less. So these articles, they can be applied to the United States too, if there is violations of those human rights. Also, everyone who works has the right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family an existence worthy of human dignity, and supplement if necessary by other means of social protection. And also, everyone has the right to form and to join trade unions for the protection of its interests. Now, of course, this is more difficult. Everybody who has worked a minimum wage job and it's still doing that, you know, it's really hard to get by. For example, a minimum wage of what is it, $9, $10 an hour, and is that a just and favorable remuneration for the work that somebody does? For example, somebody that works at McDonald's, right? So that's still a question that's being debated. And last, regarding the defending of human rights, I wanted to point out that there's another office that actually can work towards ensuring and defending human rights, and this would be the office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, known as the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, or the United Nations of Human Rights Office, which is actually a department of the Secretariat of the United Nations that works to promote and protect human rights that are guaranteed under international law as stipulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. And this office was established by the United Nations General Assembly on December 20th of 1993. And they have been more aggressive in putting pressure on abusive governments to adhere to their human rights obligations. For example, they condemn abusive governments' media releases and lobby other governments to apply diplomatic, economic, and political pressure on defending states. And I think this is really interesting because, as we see with the situation in Ukraine and the abuses going on there, the media does play an important role. We have on all the pretty much the news channel the ongoing situation in Ukraine, because it does affect to some extent all of us. And it is really important to think about these human rights every day and not to take them for granted, and to also fight so that those human rights are respected. All right, class, hope you enjoyed this lecture. Good luck with the quiz. If you have any questions, let me know, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.